There we are, Anthony Smith, living that remote life here at Freightonomics. Thanks everybody for joining us once again every Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard. I guess we're on daylight time now, Anthony Smith.
I
Looking
have
good
no
today.
idea. I lived in Arizona for like 8 years and I refuse to get caught up to date or take any responsibility for any kind of daylight saving times changes. I just go with the flow at this point.
All right, it doesn't matter. You're time irrelevant, like time agnostic.
It's a concept. I mean,
You're a
eh,
concept.
you're not wrong. I want to argue that, but you're not wrong. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is Freightonomics. And for those of you that might be joining us for the first time, I'm Anthony Smith, lead economist and strategic executive producer here at FreightWaves, and I'm here with Zach Strickland, my buddy, my pal, and co-host here on Freightonomics, and also the Sultan of Sonar and the director of Freight Market Intelligence. Zach, we're here.
Yeah. We are here. We are here once again. As much as everybody's trying to resist us, we keep coming back.
You
So,
can't stop it.
Anthony Smith, we were going to have market expert Henry Byers on this week, but he had an illness situation come up, so he had to bail on us here last minute. But hopefully, we'll get him here in the next few weeks because Anthony, I don't know if you've heard about this ongoing story or not about the Suez Canal. Have you heard about this? Have you seen this?
What's that?
The Suez Canal. It's
What is
a
that?
waterway over, and
Oh,
there a bunch of boats go through it.
was it a big
Anyway,
deal?
there was a boat. Yeah, there was a boat
Yeah.
that lodged itself and clogged up a huge maritime thoroughfare over there on the other side of the globe, and it's been such a big deal that it has thrust the freight environment and transportation, global transportation, into memes, into pop culture memes. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like nothing I've ever seen before, where some sort of freight transportation thing. And here's the first one right here. I love memes in general. So this is the first one. My COVID depression and anxiety, the size of it lodged in this huge canal, and there I am trying to dig out of it with this tiny little excavator, which is probably in reality pretty big, going on a daily walk. I mean, that
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean,
like you said, it's one of
it
these things like we live and breathe in transportation. And of course, Henry Byers would be the perfect one to have. I mean, when we have the title, the term market expert, he is a true market expert. I think of Henry Byers, I think of yourself, and I think of John Kingston every time I think of a market expert. But when we're looking at this, it's like we live and breathe transportation. So it's weird when we see something like this enter the mainstream real world where we're just seeing memes
exactly.
left and right. We have another one here, and
This
everyone's
one
just kind
this
of
one
getting
hits
in
home
on
with
the fun.
me.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one hits home with me in terms of my procrastination and ability to put off everything as I sit wedged in between two procrastinating situations.
I
How do you
wonder,
feel about
like,
this one?
there are a few questions I want answered. I don't know. Like, we know the impact of the situation, and we're going to get into some of that. But it's just like, is there one person that's being held accountable for this? Is there a group of people that's being held accountable for this? Are we ever going to know those names? Are they going to just kind of fade into the bushes like Homer Simpson and that other, is it GIF? GIF? I don't know. But are they
Yeah.
just going to fade into the background like nothing ever happened? Or is this going to be some kind of special story that we're going to see down the line 5 years from now? Like, hey, remember that Suez
Yeah.
Canal blockage? That was me.
hmm This one I think is the crowd favorite, especially for those in kind of my generation, and maybe a little bit into your generation, Anthony, where the Ross Geller pivot scene in Friends becomes a big thing. And me and my friends still use this quote to this day. And it's 20 years old. There we go, showing some age here. Does this relate to you at all, or is this beyond your age group?
So is this Friends?
Yeah. See, okay.
Never watched it. Never,
There it is. There it is.
never watched
All
it.
right.
I
All right.
think
I
it
got one
was in
more
my
meme.
generation though, but I just think I skipped it for some reason.
So maybe it's an Anthony thing. So I
It
got one
is.
more meme. So this thing has been so popular that it has brought so much joy to people's lives, even though it's a giant catastrophe. People are now calling Joshua Seth, calling for add another ship so we can continue to have these memes as they flood the internet.
I mean,
I mean, that's the state of the world.
I love the chaos, but I much rather take this chaos this March 2021 versus the chaos that was March 2020. I'm thinking about like last year, it was the longest month ever. That March would not end. It just kept going on and on and on. And it's just like in relation, we have a much lighter, it's frustrating because we can kind of we're going to get into some of the impacts from all this blockage that's going on,
Yeah.
but it's a much better form of chaos than where we were a year ago.
Yeah, I think also we've kind of gotten adjusted to this new chaotic world that we live in, where almost like tragedy becomes like entertainment. Like, I mean, not that that wasn't really a thing before, but it's still like, after the last year, it's even though this is terrible, nobody's getting hurt or anything like that. All it is just compounding some, and it does have some major economic impacts down the road potentially, and we'll break those down here shortly. So I think that if you can't, I mean, all we can do at this point, especially with all these tragedies, is just kind of laugh and have some fun with it when we can. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that in this situation. You agree?
Yeah, I agree. And like you said, there's going to be impacts. I mean, there are already blockages. We're talking about LA and how many it's there were all there's going to be compounding effects, just as you mentioned, and it's just like we get to the point where I'm thinking as an economist, things are going to get like really kind of held back. There's these blockages. We're already behind, and now we're going to be looking at potential inferior goods being pushed on somebody. Like, are you going to foist these inferior goods on the consumers? And so we're going to get into that here shortly. Also, almost forgot to mention we're on LinkedIn right now. So if you're watching 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on a Wednesday, we are on LinkedIn. Thanks so much for joining us. And so if you want to jump in on the conversation, feel free, add some convo to this whole topic. And I'm going to open up Facebook as well because we're streaming there. So if you're there, if you're
Nice.
watching us, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, so let's dive right into it, Anthony. I know we kind of had some fun there in the beginning, but this is a big deal, especially for transportation providers. I kind of want to wade through this a little bit, and hopefully we'll have Henry on here in some sort of subsequent show to kind of follow up with it. But I talked to him when he was available to talk, and basically it boils down to what does this mean for domestic freight? What does it mean for global transportation and the global economy? Because it's all connected. We've got a couple of stories circulating on FreightWaves.com, addressing this issue, and I think they're both very interesting. Greg Miller has the first one talking about U.S. ports shippers face major fallout from Suez Canal chaos. Basically, illustrating that there is a significant amount of freight that is impacted as the Suez Canal is blocked. Some of the major lanes, especially in the trade war, we've talked about this in the past, where a lot of shippers have resourced some of their goods to Southern Asia, India, Italy. Not that Italy's tremendously like in the direct line, but those ships that are on the rotation going through the ports in Italy, et cetera, are on that rotation. So the maritime freight network is just as connected and interconnected as that domestic transportation one. So, just because your freight isn't necessarily on the ships that are blocked, there's all sorts of downstream effects here, and Greg Miller does a great job wading through some of those with some pretty key stats.
Those downstream effects are right. I mean, when I first got to FreightWaves and really kind of dove into freight economics and the intricacies of it all and the downstream effects, Henry Byers was one of the guys that I really got in close with because he would talk about all these things coming off over on these ships, these massive containers being brought into the country. What's on those ships? And then that's going to kind of in turn turn into what are we stocking up these warehouses with? What are consumers buying? And it's just like it's all interconnected. And just as you mentioned, Greg Miller does a great job breaking this all down here.
Yeah, and that now the next article that I think everybody should check out for sure. Lorianne LaRocco writes this one. She's interviewing, the president of the Panama Canal. Basically runs the operations there, and he's giving insight into why the Panama Canal is not necessarily at as much risk for having a similar situation occur in the Panama Canal. He basically goes on to state, we are a freshwater canal with locks. Suez Canal does not have locks. It is a tidal flow regulated, estuary. So the Suez moves on the ocean tide. The soil here is essentially rock, so we dredge day in and day out to make sure we have adequate draft. We are more confined and have defined watershed. So they can control their environment a lot more so, is basically what he's saying here. So ships are put on, he goes on to state that he had, everybody has a tugboat associated with it. They are controlling the flow of the ships a lot more so than they do in the Suez. The Suez, they don't really escort you through it. You just kind of flow through it. And he says that they are not necessarily as um, impacted by the weather events because of this, even though they have significant wind. For those of you that don't know, really what they're pointing as the reason for this was, significant wind event. So a huge dust storm comes across the Arabian Peninsula there, and there was a tanker that actually decided not to go through the Suez Canal based on some of the weather information that they were given, and they talked it through because all these boats are like skyscrapers. So they act like sails, if you will. All those containers being piled up there, on the LNG tankers and all that stuff being piled up on those ships, basically catches all that wind. So think about how huge these vessels are. One of the things that he talks about in his interview is the fact that the Panama ships aren't necessarily as big as the ships going through the Suez either. So they have a much smaller berth, much smaller capacity, and so therefore they're not as exposed to those elements. But that's just one way that they're talking about. Like, there's all these different nuances between these two canals that basically says that the same event is much, much less likely to go through the Panama Canal than it is on the Suez.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking of this, keeping on the Suez, you were challenging me on some Suez facts earlier on. So I'm not sure if you
Well, I
have
mean,
any US facts to share with us.
yeah, I do. I do have some Suez facts. I always like looking at facts. Random knowledge is kind of my shtick. Uh,
You're
so,
just prepping for
so
the day
any,
you go on Jeopardy. That's all it is.
yeah, but I probably won't end up there. But the Suez Canal connects the Red and Mediterranean Sea. The construction was started back in 1859 when the Ottoman Empire commissioned it. So I found that to be really fascinating. And you guys can look all this up on the internet. Wikipedia is available to everyone. But I
Why?
I
When we
just picked
have
out the
you.
ones that, yeah, I mean, so it reduces the journey from the Arabian Sea to London by about 5,500 miles. That's huge. You're talking about 8 to 10 days with an average speed of about 20 to 24 knots on a boat. So, it's about the same, way that it saves the distance going around the Cape of Africa down there, going to the United States. So about 8 to 10 days of transit is saved going through the Suez Canal. So it is a significant amount of cost, fuel, all sorts of things to go through the Suez Canal. And they were thinking about this way back, even when the pharaohs were, in charge of Egypt back in, BC times when they were building the pyramids and stuff. So there's all sorts of interesting facts about the Suez Canal that I had no idea, that I had to look up. It's 120 miles long. We mentioned no locks. The Egyptian government runs it, although there's a lot of foreign stakeholders in there, especially in Britain, that do also have a monetary interest in that canal.
Yeah, I mean, all these facts. No wonder it's causing such a how does your generation say a hullabaloo? Is that a thing?
Hullabaloo. What?
Is that what your generation? I don't know, but it's no
Mm,
wonder it's causing a big deal, and
mm,
I mean, it's going to have
mm.
downstream effects and impacts, and it just compounds everything that was already happening with the West Coast that we were seeing with freight. So that those images that we saw initially of just all of the ships that were just kind of sitting there waiting, and then looking at how, like you said, it's going to have to circumvent Africa now and just kind of have these alternate routes that's going to add these days and days onto the trip. So is how long do you think, I know you're not Henry Byers, but how long do you think
Not
this impact is going to be in place?
So I talked to Henry about this, and basically he doesn't think that there's going to be a substantial impact to the domestic, environment here. We already have huge um, backups at our ports. We now have log jams in, the East Coast ports as well. So all this does, and again, we're talking about a minimal amount of freight in relation to the stuff that comes from Asia and China. Um, that comes through the Suez. So it's really kind of, it's I don't want to minimize it to the point where it's insignificant. It is a significant amount of freight, especially to those that do have this freight coming over on this boat. But I want to show a chart, actually, the first one here on import volume. And just to put it in perspective of how much freight volume, especially like shipment volume that comes from China. And then if you look at that blue line there, as this is our basically shipment volume clearing the ports, the customs, all across the United States coming from China. So everything coming from China, 7-day rolling average, 21,000 shipments. And if you look over there on the left, I have India, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Singapore, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Malaysia. So if you add all those up, you're talking about 37% of the volume that China is responsible for in terms of import volume. So that's not like insignificant. And not all of this freight that originates in those countries comes through the Suez. These are just the countries that have the potential to send the most amount of freight into the Suez. India, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, of course, that is the obvious trade route. Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, there's kind of a kind of trade-off that you have to consider there in terms of shipping it across through the Suez and then, of course, into the Panama Canal or to the West Coast. So not all of that freight actually goes through the Suez. It's just those are the countries and these are the areas that have, the impact potential going through the Suez Canal. So you can see here, China is still a dominant force coming through the Suez Canal. And Henry Byers basically states, due to the backlog of vessels that are already present in the U.S., there are likely already vessels waiting to take their place at terminals within U.S. ports in the meantime. So they're going to use this time to kind of catch up on some of the backlog. There's stuff that's already moving back. They can speed up their transit times to make up some of this lost time. They lost several days here, but they can gain back about a day or two if they really put the hammer down on those boats.
So we're talking about the Suez Canal, and I feel like it's almost like a drinking game for those that might be watching and listening in. It's just one of those, I keep saying Suez enough. It feels like I'm saying it incorrectly, like Suez, Suez, Suez. But when looking at this, you mentioned, no, we can work through these backlogs that we currently have. Do you see any shifts to East Coast, or is West Coast going to still can stay dominant?
Yeah. So, I think to do that, we want to look at volumes by port right now, just to see what we have, because we have not actually felt any of this impact just yet in the United States. I mean, you're talking about days of transit out. They had to stop at multiple ports. If you read Greg Miller's article, you'll see a few of those examples. There's a lot of ports that they stop off at with those boats before they get to the East Coast. So you're talking about, I think the Ever Given was actually destined for the United States to be here around April 1st, which is tomorrow, for
Yeah.
those of you tuning in live. So they could actually not miss that deadline by too many days. I mean, it's still going to have a downstream impact, and there's all those logjam of boats behind it. But it's not like, we're talking months here of backlog. But if we look at the volumes by port right now, and I brought this one up because it is, you're talking about, we've already had an East Coast preference shift over the last 6 months as some of these shippers have grown their volumes, trying to get around that congestion out on the West Coast with the ports of Los Angeles, Long Beach. They found alternative ports to go to. Import volumes through Savannah, for instance, up 30% over the last 6 months. The ports of New York, New Jersey, up 2%. And this is of course, 7-day rolling average in a relative chart, so relative growth. So, 30% of Savannah isn't necessarily the equivalent of 30% in Los Angeles. So Los Angeles on the chart before this was down 5%. And you can see here in this next one is that, Savannah has seen a significant surge of freight volume. So this is the customs, the import shipments coming through the ports of Savannah, laid over the top of our outbound tender volume index. So the outbound tender volume index there in orange, the customs shipments there in blue. You can see there's a pretty deep connection in Savannah to import volumes and domestic truckload freight. As those import volumes have grown, so has the truckload freight, and that has led to a pretty significant event in the Southeast. You saw, for those of you that watch our midday market updates and all our other media involving what the trucking market's doing, we had a pretty unexpected jump in our outbound tender rejection index nationally here over the last week. I talked about how it might be contributed to Easter and all this kind of stuff, but really the volume surge in Savannah and Atlanta, and Savannah are very connected, obviously, as a lot of that freight moves into the Atlanta market on the end. The rail comes into Atlanta, drays over and gets on domestic truckload there. But um, so the most significant increase in tender rejection rates in the United States over the last week have been in Atlanta and Savannah. And if we pull up our Atlanta rejections here, it's pretty clear cut. So Savannah outbound tender rejection rates, this is the rate at which carriers reject load tenders from shippers. So shipper sends over the request that, hey man, I got some freight that's moving from Savannah to wherever in the United States, Columbus, Albany, etc., Dallas. The carrier's basically like, nah, man, I can't cover you today. Almost 50% of the time, 1 out of every 2 loads in the last week out of Savannah was being rejected on the contracted freight side. So if you look down there at, Atlanta in the blue, Atlanta jumped up to 27%. Atlanta, of course, a much bigger market than Savannah in terms of overall freight potential, but still 1 out of every, that jump there from 30% to almost 50% happened in just a matter of days. Again, capacity is impacted across the country with stuff like this. I pulled up Ontario there and the purple line just to show that even Los Angeles felt, some of this capacity disruption with tender rejection rates jumping up there as well, 3,000 miles across the country.
Yeah, and just real quick, I have to give a quick shout out to our viewership right now on LinkedIn. We have Rachel Jackson saying loves this information. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rachel, for joining us today. Also, I have a quick shout out for our team, our media team. We have one of the best media teams in the business. Shout out to Jimmy Carden, Cody, Crystal, Frazier, Good Game, all of them. But looking at this, Zach, it's nuts to see that nearly 50% is being rejected within that lane. It's absolutely
Yeah.
nuts.
Yeah, and the Savannah is the 3rd largest port by volume in the United States in terms of inbound TEUs or 20-foot equivalents. And it's, shippers are obviously scrambling to try to get around this. And just as soon, all those volumes, you saw the growth on the East Coast there. All that was happening before the Suez Canal was blocked. So they were trying to get around it. So the shippers are doing the best they can to get the freight into the country, trying to get around the current situation. And then what happens? But a log jam happens halfway around the world. Some high winds knock a boat into the sand there, and yet another log jam to the overall supply chain management organization point. So we mentioned that the domestic freight volumes probably aren't going to see that much disruption, and if we do, it's going to be a few days to a few weeks before we see that played out, ironed out. The congestion's already there. Are they going to miss a few containers here and there? Probably not, according to Henry Byers. The biggest risk, he stated, really, and this was echoed in the Lorian Larocco article as well, that transportation, this is just another reason that transportation costs, transportation rates, specifically on the maritime side, are going to stay elevated. So if we look at the transportation rates, the Freightos Baltic Exchange daily index here that measures spot rates for 40-foot equivalents coming from China to North America's East and West Coast, that East Coast rate there, really high, 5,700. The West Coast rate, though, remains extraordinarily high in relation to the East Coast rate. So they're still trying to push, the freight forwarders and the maritime providers are still trying to push freight to the East Coast from China, according to that rate there, because it costs so much money, almost as much money to ship it to Los Angeles than it does to ship it to, Savannah and points like, New York, New Jersey on average. So this is a situation that's not going to resolve itself quickly, more than likely, especially when we see something like this. Eventually, if you look back at May and June of last year, rates to ship to the West Coast were around $1,500, $1,300 to $1,500, and now they're up over $5,000. That is just insane. These costs are going to get passed along, And, to kind of summarize this whole thing up, we are talking about basically this is going to get absorbed into consumer prices eventually. We talked about inflation the
Say it.
last time we were
Say
on
it.
here.
Yeah, there it is.
This
Inflation.
is this is this is just one more step on our way to inflation. This is not a good thing for it to sustain this long. Like this is
Yeah.
just, I know transportation providers and everybody's watching the maritime carrier stocks go through the roof, et cetera. But this is not a long-term sustainable event. It these kind of increases, you're talking about a 500%, nearly a 500% increase year over year in shipping rates. Now, these are the spot rates; they're not the contracted rates, which are much lower, or they tend to be much lower. Um, but still, this is just indicative of the overall. We've seen it in trucking. These rates are too much to absorb that quickly.
Mhm.
And I mean, at some point, this also the shippers, the companies that are ordering these manufactured goods are also not going to have the money to keep spending at this rate. So
Yeah.
eventually, it will catch up, and I think that's the
Yeah.
real long term risk here. You agree?
Big time.
That's more your speed.
Big time. And I'm glad you mentioned that because I've been talking about inflation for some time and it's like not a lot of headlines are covering this. And I get it. We had core inflation that was released not too long ago. I think it was just yesterday, up 0.1% core inflation. But from previous shows, as I mentioned, I don't think we're going to see traditional inflation as we may have expected just with the printing or increasing of money supply. Of course, it goes into the velocity of money, how much it's being exchanged, how quickly it's exchanging hands, savings, what people are putting money into, the production rate, things like that. But when we have, so one thing that's going to get released tomorrow is going to be the ISM PMI, the Institute for Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index. We have a chart for that. And so when we look at the ISM PMI, it's going to be really an indicator of what's happening for the overall manufacturing segment. And so within the ISM PMI, we saw an upward movement. And so within that index, there are components. There's a new orders component, there's a production component, there's a pricing component, things like that. The pricing component is up into the 90s. And that the way you read that, say you're a purchasing manager named Ethan, and you make you're making these purchases, and you have this survey that you put out on a monthly basis, and that anything over 50 is indicative of expansion, anything below 50 is indicative of contraction. And now it's well over 50, it's in that 90 mark. So I'm going to be watching prices closely because it's been ramping up month after month after month, and it's only so much that can be done with this kinds of increases. And we're seeing a shortage in supplies, commodities, and it's not just within manufacturing, but housing as well. Looking at housing prices, existing home sales, new home sales, these things are up. Other assets are up. We're looking at stocks. You're looking at people putting money into Bitcoin. People are spending, and inflation is happening. It just not might be happening in the ways and people were anticipating with the increased money supply that we have going on right now.
Yeah, so we definitely don't have enough time to dive all the way into that detail, but it is like, I mean, it's inevitable, right? I mean, I was looking at the PPI a few weeks ago, and that's the producer price index. On how much it costs to make these goods that people are ordering. It's starting to rise a lot faster here over the last couple of months than it has in the previous year at all. And of course, the CPI has been a little bit more stable, but yeah, I mean, what do you think? I mean, is this a really significant risk to our economic recovery?
I definitely think it is. I mean, if it's not done in a very precise manner, we're probably going to have, likely going to have additional stimulus payments, but we also have employment starting to come back. So we saw the most recent jobs report showing an increase. So finally, we're seeing a little bit of leveling or a comparable story with initial jobs claims. So good to see. But as we see more people come back to work, more people in jobs, we're going to need to see that stimulus kind of taken back. And now, with that, we also need to see some kind of program put in place for those people that may be evicted. How can they begin those repayment programs? How are they going to be protected as opposed to having to owe everything all at once? And so it's a really fine line. It's going to be a balance. And this has been Freightonomics.
Yeah, I mean, bring out the ukulele, Anthony. So download the FreightWaves TV app on podcast players everywhere. Look up Freightonomics or look up Freightcast and get every FreightWaves podcast. And Anthony, I'm so glad to see you and your ukulele.
We'll see you all next time.